Okay, just recently, Daniel Nistico asked whether I could actually do a video specifically for guitar players, and um, yeah, I think his main bent would be classical guitar, but I think he's accepting of other styles of music as well, but specifically acoustic guitar, and how the software that I've developed can actually help in producing quality recordings for that sort of thing for the, I don't know, amateur to professional musician who wants to dabble in recording themselves. Um, so basically, last year I finished a composition, a classical guitar composition called Unimaginatively Variations Number Two, and I've basically used that as demonstration material for this video, and recorded it with this microphone, which is ADK 1-inch condenser pressure gradient style microphone with a cardioid polar pattern. So basically, it's a directional microphone, and yeah, a 1-inch microphone. And basically, the instrument that I used is this. Don't ask me how much it cost, because I basically got it as a giveaway from my brother, and I'm not sure whether he actually paid for it. I think his story he gave me was it was a friend's and they left it behind when they left the country or something. It's as far as my research goes, the brand name is Angelique. It's like a Japanese rip-off of a classical guitar design, probably manufactured in the 1970s or 80s, something like that period. Tonally, it's reasonably good, but it's rather peaky in the bass, so it tends to sound a bit monotone for certain notes in the bass. It's not particularly loud in terms of acoustic guitars. That's not necessarily a problem, but yeah, well, I guess it might be if you want to do unamplified concerts with it. But for me, which is just an amateur at this thing, yeah, it's fine. Maybe someday down the track I'll get something better. The strings are just D'Adrio, however you pronounce that. Just the stand. Well, I don't know exactly the line. I can't remember exactly the line of nylon string classical guitar strings they were, because they make a fair number of different variations. But yeah, that's what they are. They're actually pretty old at this stage. They've probably been on there for, I don't know, upwards of 2 years by now, I think. I think nothing more that's particularly remarkable about that to comment on. In terms of me playing it and recording it with this microphone, it was sort of what you might call a midfield position. I generally don't record very close to the guitar, because then you get near field effects. And by that I mean the entire guitar body is involved in producing sound. It's not just coming from the sound hole, it's coming from the entire body of the guitar. So if you place, say, a microphone here very close to the sound hole, it's got a bias to picking up everything coming from the sound hole a lot louder than, say, sound emanating from down here, which changes the timbre of the sound of the guitar, the tonality. It doesn't sound like it would sound to a listener listening to you play, because they're in the mid to far field. So basically, if I record this instrument, and if I want to record a lot of instruments, I tend to try not to, well, it depends on what it is. If you want isolation, obviously you need to record close to the instrument, like if it's in an ensemble and you want isolation for mixing purposes, then you will have to record close to the instrument and then deal with the issues of altered tone of the instrument through equalization. But for a solo instrument like this, I generally don't want to be too close in terms of the microphone placement. The flip side to that is the further away the microphone, well, there's two negatives to that. The further away from the microphone, further away from the instrument the microphone is, the less signal level reaching the microphone is. So the microphone will pick up room noise, outside noise, and also room effects in terms of coloration of your instrument sound by the resonances, standing waves in the room, more as you move away from the guitar. So it's a balancing act between those two. And the other aspect of as well is, depending on how good your preamps are, you're going to have a certain amount of microphone and preamp hiss coming through, and that's going to be more pronounced the further you are away from your instrument when you're recording it. So typically in this case, I would have been like that sort of distance. It's sort of sub 1 meter, but maybe 80, 90 centimeters or something like that. Not too far away, but far enough away to get a reasonably equal distance from all parts of the guitar body to the microphone, so that you don't distort the color of what it's picking up. Now, what else to discuss before I get on to the actual recording itself? There's obviously multiple ways of going about recording classical instruments. Like, instead of using a monophonic mic, some people might want to use, say, a stereophonic mic to pick up a stereo field. And then by virtue of doing that, getting a stereo image in your actual recording environment. That can be good and effective, and using multiple microphones for the same reason to get a stereo effect. But there are downsides to that as well. The main downside from my perspective of actually doing that, of using a stereo mic in your recording environment, is it then, well, you can't, if you start trying to alter the mix post-recording of that, it sort of breaks the match between your playback device and the microphone, so you can end up with some strange imaging effects going on if you try and recast, if you like, your recording to a different environment. So essentially, when you're using a microphone array like a stereo mic for a stereo source, or alternatively, say for instance you wanted to do a surround sound recording in 5.1 or 7.1.2 or something like that, then it becomes even more complicated, because now instead of having a stereo mic, you need, like in 7.1.2, you need a microphone that has 9 channels basically, because obviously we don't need the subwoofer channel, but we need the other. So there's 9 microphones, and not only do you have 9 microphones, they have to be placed in a array that's compatible with a typical 7.1.2 setup, and then they also have to have a polar response, each of the microphones, such that there's not too much overlap between each of the channels. So you pretty quickly get into very expensive, esoteric sort of microphones to actually achieve that. And I know there are people who actually record classical music in Atmos sort of formats that actually do that, and do that quite successfully. But it requires a complicated microphone, which is going to add you a considerable amount of cost to your recording. And in doing so, you sort of saying implicitly from the start that you're not actually going to be mixing your recording. It is what it is when it's captured in the venue that you perform in, and that's it. And you can't really alter that. You got to live with that. If you try and alter that, then it sort of defeats the whole purpose of the array microphone pickup in the first place, and will more than likely come up with strange imaging issues. So generally that's the reason why I don't use a stereo microphone for this, or something more sophisticated if I wanted to do a surround sound recording or something like that. Alternatively, now the drawback of, without sophisticated processing, the drawback of just using a monophonic microphone I can illustrate quite simply with this whiteboard, and hopefully I don't get too much reflection. I've got to position it correctly so I don't. But I'm going to get the lid off. Let's say, for instance, you have a simple recording space. I won't draw the back wall, and I'll ignore reflections off the back wall, but say your performer is sitting there, and you as the listener may be sitting here or something like that. So when you actually hear this performance, you're hearing a direct path there. You're probably hearing a reflection off the back wall there. You can hear, say, a reflection off that wall, a reflection off that wall. Potentially you can get a reflection that's coming off like that, and similarly like this. So the key point is, as well as hearing the direct path, you are also hearing delayed reflections, because these take longer, because they're longer distances, they arrive at a later time than the direct path. But you'll note that they're coming, apart from the one off the rear wall, they're coming from all different angles. So that is what gives performance in a live space its sense of enveloping you with sound, because you get these sounds coming from a different direction. But then now if I take this situation, and we record it with a mono mic as such, but now switch to, and I won't even worry about the walls at this stage, I'll forget about the walls, switch to a sound reproduction system. Now you've got your listener here, and you've got one loudspeaker here for stereo and another one over here. And then through panning, you get a direction. So that microphone has now collapsed all those different directions into the one direction. So if you just pan it centrally, it's going to sound like everything, all those reflections are coming from the one direction, which is why taking a monophonic recording of something in a reverberant space and playing it back through loudspeakers, it doesn't really sound real, because now you're not getting that enveloping sound field, because everything's appearing to come from one direction, whatever that pan direction set up in your mix was. And that's the fundamental problem with using a monophonic mic without subsequent processing. But for me, what I actually have in terms of processing is twofold. And this comes from the desire to want to reproduce what you might want to call an ideal auditorium electronically rather than through the recording, because through recording it's very difficult to actually capture accurately what an auditorium sounds like and not have problems with artifacts and phasing issues and things like that. Like typically the way you would do it is you have multiple microphones, you have room microphones to pick up ambience and things, and then you blend them together. But in doing so, you're invariably going to get some constructive/destructive interference patterns going on between those multiple sources that doesn't accurately reflect what you would have heard if you were sitting in that room. So that's why my approach is pretty much forget about that altogether. Just record the instrument. Don't concern yourself with that until you get to your mixing stage, if you want to call it that, or it's just a processing stage in this in this particular case, because we've only got one instrument. We're not blending multiple instruments. So I have a plugin, or I have two VST3 plugins. One that provides diffuse reverberant field, which is basically the afterglow of sound in an auditorium, if you like. It's sound that, like in an ideal sense, diffuse reverberation is like an afterglow. It's just, it has no direction. If it's totally diffuse, it feels like it's coming from all directions and all times at once. So it doesn't sound like an echo. It just sounds like this afterglow is the best word I can think of describing it, or impression. Yeah. But the other important component to a reverberant field or an acoustic space is early reflections. And I guess I can start with that. The ideal conception, the conception of an ideal acoustic environment. So if you say popped a balloon in a room, you'd have like a pressure spike. Say I'm drawing a graph here, and this is time in this axis. So time going that way, that's t equals 0. And this is from the perspective of I'll call this amplitude, pressure amplitude. So this is from the perspective of a listener. So you pop a balloon at time t0, and then at a certain time after that, the listener will hear it. So that's the direct path propagation delay from here to here. And then at some time after, they'll start hearing other reflections, which are the early reflections coming off the walls, like we had in the previous diagram. And these carry on, and then eventually you get to a reverberant tail, which has just got lots and lots of independent reflections all blurred together, which is the reverberation part. Now in ideal acoustics, basically there are a series of time regions that you need to respect to get the best possible sound. And the first region you can call this, which is the early reflection region, and this has to do with psychoacoustics, and in particular the Hass effect. And basically the Hass effect says that if you hear an echo within around about 70 milliseconds, 70 or 80 milliseconds of the initial source, your brain, when it hears it, merges these together. So you don't actually hear a physical echo, you just hear something that's constructively adding to the original sound. But if it comes after that, then it'll start sounding like an echo. And that's not what you want to hear in an auditorium. So good auditorium acoustics tries to make all the earlier reflections arrive at a listener at a given position at a time that is less than, say, 70 or 80 milliseconds from the initial arrival of the direct path to the listener. And then they try to have this dead space here. This is the late reflections. They try to not have anything there, because that will be perceived as an echo, and it's not just that it'll be perceived as an echo, but if it arrives within, I think it's up to about 250 milliseconds, something like that. From 70 milliseconds to 250 milliseconds, if you have reflections arriving in that interval, they will be perceived, one, as an echo, and two, it'll more than likely distract from the original content and make the intelligibility of what you're listening to harder to comprehend. So in the ideal world of acoustics design, you want to have lots of early reflections occurring under 70 to 80 milliseconds, nothing occurring from there to about 250 milliseconds, and then everything that occurs after that, you want a diffuse field, which is basically, as I said before, it's like reflected sound, but it's coming at all directions and all times in a relatively even fashion that decays away nice and uniformly. And if you have that, then you have ideal acoustics. So the typical way it's achieved in, well, I guess one common way that I've seen in auditoriums that they achieve the early reflection part is they have walls that look like this, basically. So if you imagine you've got a performer here, get rid of this rubbish. If you've got a performer here and you're here, so basically you can see that there is a potential path that will go from there to there, and there will be a potential path that will go from there to there, and there will be a potential path that will go from there to there. So you, for each of these convex shapes on the wall, you can potentially get one early reflection coming to a listener, and it doesn't matter where they are in this direction, there's likely going to be one for each of those convex shapes. So that's why they actually do that. But the other thing they typically want to do is they don't want to have a reflection off the back wall coming back. because that's more than likely going to, particularly in a larger concert hall, it's more than likely going to arrive in that late reflection time period, not the diffuse time period. So they want to try and avoid that. Either try and avoid reflection off the back wall, or then have a diffuser of some sort on the back wall that scatters the sound in all directions to reduce that amplitude of those late reflections, and then add to the reverb tail. The other approach that you can basically use as well is to try and absorb all the sound post the first reflections in an acoustic space, but that generally results in a concert hall that sounds rather dead, so it's not really that effective. But anyway, that was my aside on room acoustics. So the important thing is you need to replicate the sound of a good concert hall. You need to have two things. You need to have your early reflections, and then you need to have the diffusion, the diffuse tail. So I have two VST3 plugins that I've written. One which is called a Spatial Panner, which I use to create early reflections that are suggestive of a simple room geometry. Basically those three wall. Oh, don't think the orange works. So the Spatial Panner, for instance, I can put a listener here, and then I can put a performer, say here, wherever you want, and it'll synthesize these paths and give them the right panning angles for stereo reproduction to mimic that, basically. So it actually, and also, obviously it doesn't produce hugely complicated model, because it has to be computationally tractable so that I can actually implement it in real time. But it has basically, if I remember right, 6 different reflection paths. So there's a combination of 6 different reflection paths. So in the simplest of cases, in that timeline, what you'll end up with, again, is you'll have your arrival of the burst balloon, and then you'll have, I don't know, 6 other arrivals at various times, various amplitudes depending on where you're positioned. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm missing one there. But then to actually add a level of complexity on top of that, without making it computationally inefficient, for each of these single reflections that arrive in a particular direction, I actually break those out into 7 more. So that's 42 early reflections in total. So by that I mean, again, on my timeline, if the original without the diffusion component added to it looked like that, it arrived at that time, I take this particular impulse that's coming through and I break it into 7 different impulses that on a power basis add to the same amplitude. So you'll get, instead of that, you'll get like 7 different, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, 7 different and sort of randomly dispersed in time reflections, random dispersion in time and some level of random dispersion in amplitude, but the overall power of that is equivalent to that. So it replaces that with that, basically. So it makes it much more complicated in terms of what you hear. So it sounds more authentic, like a real auditorium with lots of different arrivals coming different times. But because it's done on that, you've still only got the 6 different directions. So you've got 42 reflections in 6 different directions. So it's a reasonable approximation of early reflections. So that's that aspect. And you have full control of how big that geometry is. So you can change how wide that space is. Well, I keep on taking the orange one, but basically what you have control of is this width, and you have the control of that, and you also have control of, you can't see it, but the ceiling height, because it's just shown in a two-dimensional plane. So you've got quite a bit of flexibility. So if, for instance, now I take my monophonic recording, which is recorded pretty much near field, or maybe you recorded at far field, but so that'll be monophonic. It has all the room reflections picked up in my listening room here, embedded in it. But then that gets retranslated through this to come from all different directions. So whatever reflections were actually in the original recording, when fed through an arrangement like this, even though it's got those extra reflections, all it does is, in a sense, just embellish the early reflections in that recording. So you can quite easily take a small room sound and translate it into a believable big room sound with no problem whatsoever. Now, the only aspect that that doesn't have is the diffusion, but then I have another VST3 plugin called Synthetic Space that actually realizes idealized diffusion reverb tail. And the way it does that is basically, in a very quick sense, you basically have a bunch of, again, if I do a timeline, you've got a bunch of exponential decaying echoes. So I've got an echo, if it was an exponential decay at a certain time interval, you get one that looks like that, one looks like that, one looks like that. So you got that, but then instead of just having one, it has a whole series of them. I can't even remember how many I've got, but there's quite a few, and they're all slightly different times. So, and the timing of them are set up basically based on prime numbers. So like one timing isn't divisible by another timing, so none of them ever overlap. So you might have one that looks like that, and they also have slightly different amplitudes. So you might have one that looks like this, for instance, and one on the other side, and they're set up such that it basically fills up this entire space. So that's one level of processing. But then on top of that, all this filtering arrangement is fed by a all-pass finite impulse response filter with a length that's like for the ideal acoustic is going to be the length of, or round about the length of the discrete early reflections. I mean, the early reflection period, the ideal early reflection period, like 70 milliseconds. So you basically have this really dense impulse response that lasts for around about 70 milliseconds. So if you feed that into those discrete impulses, basically this gets spread out across all of that, so you end up with something that looks almost like a continuum of diffusion. So when you combine those two things together, you end up with something that's quite indistinguishable from an ideal gee, my room's getting a bit dark. Clouds coming over. Ideal acoustic. So you synthesize an ideal acoustic electronically, and you have a choice of how big that's going to be. So anyway, now I can actually, there's other aspects to it as well that I do, but that in terms of the designing a room space for your recording is a major factor in the quality of what you end up with in the end. The other major factor is equalization to get the best out of your recording of your instrument. So I'll just illustrate my process right now. Okay, so here is my recording of Variations number 2. You can see there's a lot of edits in here. That's just a reflection of the fact that I'm pretty ordinary as a classical guitar player. Made plenty of mistakes, plenty of hesitations. I've just taken out the mistakes and the hesitations. There are still some mistakes in there, but ones that I'm happy to live with to keep it authentic and human. So that was, I basically recorded that straight from my microphone. I've done the edits in here, and then I'll render this out. So basically go to the bounce menu and project and selection. Okay, I won't actually carry it out, but I rendered it to, where's my Variations number 2? There you go. I would do that. I'm not going to do it now because I've already done it once. That's pretty much it for that session. So if I quit this, don't know why it thinks I've changed something. Don't know what I changed, but I won't save it. Then I go into my Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer application, which is an equalizer. Let's maximize it a bit. Make it a bit bigger so you can see it all. So what this does, see, this is my Variations number 2. I've actually already designed a filter. What it does is when you open it up, it does a complete spectrum analysis of the entire track. It gives you an average statistic here. So the green, actually it's the dark grey here is the original because the green is showing what I've modified. But if it didn't have a filter in place, the green would correspond to the average spectrum, but this is average post filter because it's been modified, and the peak is the yellow trace here. So that's the peak spectrum output for the entire track. Then what you can do is you can break it up into sections on the timeline and look at each and filter each independently, which is what I've done. I've done it based on the structure of the music. So I've put in these, you can see different sections here based on the structure of my music. If I click on this, you see it'll give you a different average, which just, and peak and average statistic, which just corresponds to this portion of the piece of music. And you can see that I've addressed some issues with what I found to be too loud peaks here in the bass end. I've also reduced the upper mid-range to add warmth to the sound of the guitar, because I thought it sounded somewhat harsh. And the other thing is some of these bass notes, like here in particular, are too muted, so I've boosted that there. And I've done similar things in the other sections. Again, something that was too loud, I thought, and adds some warmth by reducing that. Likewise here, reduced something that was too loud and added the warmth by reducing the upper mid-range. Reducing the upper mid-range mainly here, but reducing those peaks a little bit again to reduce some stridency. And again, same sort of thing. Now, why is this superior or more effective to use than conventional equalization? Well, the main benefit is the fact that it gives you this comprehensive analysis of the content of the track. So if you actually listen through your track and hear something that disturbs you, it's relatively straightforward to figure out where that issue is coming from, if it is spectrum related, and then add a correction to it. Whereas if you're doing it entirely by ear, that is very difficult, especially if you have to contend with the problem being confined to just a very narrow portion of spectrum, because that fundamentally relates to how we hear and the limitations of human hearing. So it's an almost impossible task to actually do an effective edit on a narrow bandwidth using human hearing and a conventional equalizer. There's one other aspect that's very, very important to take note of, and that is this application takes into consideration the changing loudness with an equalization change. So for instance, if I were to soften up this upper mid-range in a conventional equalizer, I'd dial up a cut in that region of the spectrum, you know, between 1 kilohertz and 5 kilohertz or something, and reduce it by, I don't know, 2 or 3 dB, something like that. If I do that, what happens is the overall level of that that music now reduces. And because our hearing is biased in such a way that louder things always sound better than quieter things, pretty much almost invariably, it means doing that cut change will sound worse to you because you haven't compensated for the drop in amplitude of the overall track. This equalizer here does all that automatically. So if you dial in a change to the mid-range of however many dB, it, using an internal loudness model, a Zwicker loudness model, figures out that it has to add a certain amount of gain to make the before and after loudness of that edit to be consistent with one another, so you can make an unbiased judgment as to whether that sounds better or not. That's a lot easier than the alternative in a conventional equalizer, which is dialing in the equalizer and then making a guess at how much you have to boost the amplitude or cut the amplitude to make it a unbiased judgment of what you're doing. So those things combined, plus everything else that this is capable of, means it's at least in my opinion, a far superior approach to equalization than anything you'll get via any other tool that I'm aware of. I'm pretty much unaware of any tool that has the same feature set as Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer. There are some things that are similar, but in no way are the same. And yeah, it's quite a different beast. So if I actually get back to what it sounds like, if I switch off that equalization, you can see these little circles actually show which spectrum is actually representative of what is going to play. So this is the original, the grey ones are the original. So if I play it back, now it's the EQ'd one. Difference is quite subtle because there's not much that changed. You probably hear it more in the more mezzo forte parts, which tend to sound a bit harsh, unequalized. Particularly here, where it's strong here, it doesn't sound too great to me. Now it sounds like it's got a more even, richer sound to me than the previous. It's partly because of reducing amplitude here and boosting the amplitude here. So that's pretty much it. And then basically all I do is render this out, which again I won't do because I've already done it. Somewhere in here you'll see, there it is, it's grayed out. Click on that, save, but I'm not going to do it here. Then I can go back to my Logic Pro session. Open this one, which is basically a new session that I've imported my equalization version in. You can see it hasn't got any of those edits in it anymore. I'll zoom it out a bit so you can see, well, wrong way, see the entire timeline. So I've basically got this track here, this recording. What I've added is a multiband gate, which I use here to reduce noise, the hiss noise in the recording, because my microphone plus preamp is quite noisy and I don't want to hear most of that. So how this is different from a conventional all band noise gate is it splits the entire spectrum up into these series of bands and it gates them independently based on level. So instead of having a conventional noise gate where you suddenly go from hearing noise to not hearing any noise, with this approach, each band will cut out when the content in that band is below this user selected threshold. So the net effect of that is that the noise tends to cut away in a more smooth fashion. So it shows less artifact in terms of you hearing the noise gating effect. So you don't it's rare that you suddenly go from a lot of noise to no noise at all, because it changes based on which bands the content is dropped away to nothing. So artifact wise, it's a lot freer of artifact. It can and does have some audible artifact, but it's generally a case of what's the lesser of two evils, a slight alteration in the dynamic decay of the spectrum content of an instrument or hearing a lot of noise. So it's entirely up to the user, of course, but I actually, for the most part, find it very useful. So the thing I was talking about before, my spatial panner, this is the spatial panner. So you can see here it has these wall barriers. It also, that light grey line there represents the ceiling, so the ceiling reflection. So here you can see I can turn off or take away, if you like, walls. So with all those walls gone, there are no reflections. There's only a direct path. Oh, but there is a ceiling reflection because I didn't turn that one off. So now there's no reflections, just a direct path. Click that one on, you've got the ceiling reflection, you've got the right wall, you've got the rear wall, and you've got the left wall. These switch on and off the diffusion thing I was mentioning, whereby it takes a single reflection and converts it into 7 reflections of the equivalent power. So it adds that complexity. And here you've got control of your geometry, and it's displayed down here so you can see what it is. So this particular space, it's 20.5 meters wide, 13.8 deep, 6.9 high. This far field distance basically controls the transition between the sound of something in terms of loudness, sounding constant depending on how far how close you are to it, or in the alternative, the distance you have to go before it starts and before it sounds like the volume of what you're listening to starts to decay away because of the spherical sound radiation pattern of sound in open space. So basically, every doubling of distance means typically in far field means a 6 dB drop in amplitude. So that's just basic physics. But if you're close enough to an instrument and that instrument has a specific size, a large geometric size, and then when you're particularly close to it, it sounds like the sound level doesn't actually change with distance. It stays pretty much the same, irrespective, and that's called the near field. When it starts decaying away, that's called the far field. So that's what this far field distance allows you to change. It's the transition between the sound volume staying constant when you're close to it and the sound level falling as you move further away. It changes that transition. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for the early reflection part of things. Then on the master bus, I've basically got an instance of my reverb, my synthetic space reverb, which is realizing that diffusion tail that I was talking about. And then finally, after that, there is a limiter, which allows me to boost the level of the recording in the final output and not have anything clip, because the limiter will stop it. So I typically only boost it enough so that a very small proportion of any content gets limited. Most of it's purely unlimited. And that's just to maintain the fidelity of the sound and not introduce what I refer to as dynamic inversion, which is something that irritates me no end. So, right, I guess it comes down to illustrating what all this does and how it sounds. The thing that I should start with, I think, is bypassing the bypassing the effects of early reflection and reverb, and just listening to the recording plus noise gate. I can actually show you the effect of the noise gate as well, but I'll start with that. And you can see this bar on the right actually shows what the output of the particular band is, and the bar on the left is what's coming in. So it's gating a lot of the top there. So the easiest place to hear that is if I play the very last note, very last chord, sorry. I'll play it, I'll bypass the noise gate first. Now I'll introduce the noise gate back in. So you see the addition of the noise gate means that like without the noise gate, as this volume decays, you start to hear the hiss more and more and more as it progresses. With the noise gate, you don't hear that progression of the hiss, but what you do hear is a slight dulling of the tone of the instrument as it decays away. So that's the side effect. But it's a case of which is more satisfying, hearing the noise or hearing the slight dulling of the instrument. On certain types of music, I actually find that dulling of the instrument as it gates away, I actually find it beneficial to the way it sounds, because it increases the color contrast between the transient and what comes after it. Although obviously it can sound a little bit fake if it's too extreme. But anyway, that's basically the noise gate. Now, what happens if I introduce my early reflections through spatial panning? So we'll start with that, okay? So that's just the right wall. You can definitely hear like there's extra content coming from the right. Now there's extra content coming from the left. There's extra content coming from the rear. And extra content coming from the ceiling. What happens if I disable it all? It sounds much smaller. Now the thing you'll note that you're free to position both. You can position the performer anywhere basically. note that that pitch bending you hear when I'm moving it around, that's simply Doppler effect. That's physics. You can't do anything about that. If you move something at a high rate, obviously it's going to bend the pitch because of the Doppler effect. So if you want to dynamically move things and not hear it, it's obviously got to move at a slow rate and an even rate, because the faster it moves, the more pitch shifting you're going to get due to the Doppler effect. So again, you see I can move the performer side to side. I can only move the performer side to side because the particular model that I use to implement the panning is only capable for a stereo source, a stereo reproduction system, like left and right reproduction system. It's actually based on loudspeakers, not so much headphones. It can only realize a panning angle across a 180-degree arc. It can't do any better than that. So that's why it's restricted to this, what I call the baseline. But you can also use this particular plugin and actually you can use any of these plugins basically. You can use any of these plugins on other channel formats. So for instance, if I had a bus format that was 7.1.2, it will actually work with that. So it will then realize the 9 different channels with all the appropriate level content based on the arrival angles of all the reflections correctly, and translate that into that. And because that's a surround format, a 7.1.2 is a surround sound format, you can then move this performer anywhere in the space. Not only can you move it anywhere in the space, you can also rotate it at any angle as well. And then the actual performer here, that's the listener. You can position the listener anywhere in the space and rotate it at will. The performer, that doesn't have a concept of directionality, so it's assumed in an omnidirectional source. So there's no rotation component to it, but you can position it anywhere in space, including elevation. You can change the elevation for a surround sound with, an immersive sound format, one that's got an elevation channel. If it's just surround, then you can't elevate it, but if it's got elevation channels in it, you can. So it's very flexible. And likewise, the reverberation tail response here is going to be synthesized for all of those 9 channels. Sorry, 9 channels, because there's 7 floor channels and 2 elevation channels in 7.1.2. So basically, it will scale to whatever speaker arrangement you have. So if you're interested in making, for instance, an Atmos recording, it's perfectly capable of realizing that with a monophonic source and getting the right emulation of a real acoustic. So anyway, that's the demonstration of the early reflections. So what's the reverb tail add to the performance? So I can do that now. So it sort of adds what I would term a ghost or a memory of the music. But it's although although you hear it arriving after the, whatever, 250 milliseconds or whatever, actually what degree it arrives at will depend on how big your auditorium depth is. It's going to change with that, but it's probably around about the 100 millisecond or 200 millisecond mark at the moment. So you hear that reverb tail starting there, but it doesn't have any sense of real direction. It's sort of all enveloping, and that's easily illustrated by if I just bypass this pass-through, which is like the original. It's the original content, and then if I don't pass that through, all you'll hear is the reverb tail response. So that's just the simple monophonic recording with stereo panning. It sounds pretty boring. So there you have it. There's my demonstration of recording classical guitar, basically. I hope you find it useful and maybe inspire you to do some recording and synthesize a artificial auditorium response.